Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So in today's episode, I've got 5 houseplants that are really low maintenance. If you find that you are neglecting your plants because you don't have enough time to look after them, then this is the video for you. We all live busy lives, we all go to work or school. Some of us have kids and we all want to do hobbies in our spare time. So that means we might not have enough time to look after our houseplants. So we may be underwatering them, not fertilizing them enough, and not giving them a good pruning. These 5 plants that I've selected are low maintenance. They're relatively drought tolerant. They can handle not being fertilized for a while, and generally they don't need to be pruned that often. So really easy to care for, really low maintenance. And then at the end of the video, I've got a few honorable mentions as well. So stick around to the end. Okay then guys, so hopefully you can see me through this large plant here. It's the first plant on my list. It's the Dracaena. So the Dracaena is a really easy plant to care for. Generally it's a slow growing plant. Doesn't require too much pruning back, but that means it doesn't really end up looking too shaggy if you've had it for a while and you've not been pruning it back. I've had this guy for about 2 years, I believe, 1 or 2 years, and I've never pruned it. I've never cut it from the top or anything. I've only removed a few yellowing leaves from the bottom of the plant. That's just a natural process the plant goes through. Just shed some of its older leaves. That's all I've had to do, just pick them off. This plant doesn't seem to mind being root bound. Like I say, I've had this plant a couple of years and I've never repotted it. It stayed in this quite small terracotta pot, particularly for the size of the plant. Probably does need potting up just to get it in proportion, but it's not particularly slowed down in its growth. I've not noticed that, so it doesn't really mind being a little bit root bound in its pot. So that's ideal for those of us that don't have time to be changing the plant pots every year or every 6 months. This plant doesn't really like wet feet, so it doesn't like to be watered too often. So I water this guy probably once every 2, maybe 3 weeks. So that's quite handy if we are looking for low maintenance houseplants, so we're not always having to constantly water this plant. So it doesn't like wet feet, likes the soil to dry out thoroughly in between waterings, otherwise the leaves tend to go a little bit limp, and that's perfect for low maintenance houseplants. Number 2 on my list is the rubber plant, or otherwise known as the Ficus elastica. I've got 3 in my collection. I've got the green rubber plant and I've got the Teneki, a couple of Tenekis, and I found them to be really low maintenance. So the main reason why I've chosen this plant is because it doesn't like wet feet, much like the Dracaena. So that means that doesn't need too much watering. So I water this guy probably every 2 or 3 weeks like the Dracaena, and that seems to do fine for this plant. It really likes the soil to dry out thoroughly in between waterings. It doesn't like a soggy soil. It's got a nice well draining soil as well, so that means you're not having to keep going back to it and keep topping it up with water. It's not fussy about fertilizer either. It can go a prolonged period without fertilizer. It can go a few months if it's really needed. So that's useful because fertilizing our plants can be a bit of a time-consuming process. All that this plant really wants is just to be put in a bright location. It can handle darker conditions, but if you want a relatively fast-growing plant, then just put it in a bright spot and it will grow happily. Just give it some water every once in a while and it should just do fine. You can put it in a darker spot, like I say, and it will slow the growth down, so that could be useful if you want a low maintenance plant. I have a full care guide for this plant. I'll link it in the description, so check that out guys if you want full details of how to look after this plant and also the green rubber tree as well. Number 3 on my list is the Echeveria. So this is one of my Echeverias that I have in my house, and they are super low maintenance, really easy to care for. So as with my other 2 houseplants, there's a bit of a common theme occurring through this video. This guy doesn't need much watering. So it's a succulent, so that means that it stores its water in its thick leaves. So if we give it too much water, it's not going to like that. It's going to turn mushy, and it's really going to be detrimental to the health of the plant. So I only water this guy probably once a month at most, and it's doing very well. As you can see, it's starting to flower. So this guy doesn't really require any pruning. The only pruning it requires is when the bottom leaves, when it starts to shed its bottom leaves as it grows bigger and grows taller and starts to grow in the middle, sheds its lower leaves, they go a bit crispy. So all you need to do is just pick them off. It's not a necessity, you can leave them on. It's not harmful to the plant for you to leave them on, but just for appearance, it's always nice just to pick them off, the shriveled up leaves. That's the only pruning this plant needs. Number 4 on my list is the very popular jade plant. So jade plants are basically another type of succulent like the Echeveria. So that means that they do not like too much water. They don't like sitting in too much water. They like wet soil because they store their water in their leaves, just like the Echeveria. So that means that we don't need to be fussing over them. We don't need to be watering too much. Jade plants are really slow growing, which is useful for those of us that want low maintenance plants. So they'll only generally grow probably 3 or 4 inches per year, each stem. They don't really require any pruning. It's just a case of taking off any leaves that are yellowing or getting a bit crispy. You just want to take them off. So they are slow growing, but they do grow quite large if you let them, if you give them enough time, a good few years. This plant's not really fussy about fertilizer either. I only tend to fertilize this plant probably once every 2 months, and it seems to respond just fine. You might notice that the leaves lose a little bit of shine. Generally, they'll do just fine without a regular schedule of fertilization. I have a full care guide for this plant. I'll link to that in the description, so check that out guys if you want to know how to best care for this plant. The next plant on my list is the very popular peace lily. I have this guy here. I also have a smaller one in my bathroom. So peace lilies are really easy to care for. They don't really need to be put in a really bright location like other house plants. There's no variegation in the leaves, so they're quite happy to be 1 or 2 meters away from a east, west or south facing window. I have mine placed behind me on the floor underneath my fireplace, and the leaves are still glossy. It's still putting out new leaves even in the winter. So the peace lily will produce tall white flowers during the growing season. You don't really have to do much for it to do so. So generally just really easy to care for. So those are my top 5 low maintenance houseplants. There's a few honourable mentions that I'm just going to quickly go through. This guy, the snake plant, really easy to care for, doesn't like soggy soil, doesn't like wet feet. So really happy just to be placed anywhere in your house really. Can tolerate dark conditions. It will just sit there, do its thing really. Another honourable mention is peperomia. Generally all peperomias are generally low maintenance. That's because they don't need too much water. They like having wet feet. The same with all these plants, don't need us to keep going around them every week to water them. So this is a peperomia obtusifolia. I've propagated this guy and I've done a video on it. Check that out guys, I'll link to it in the description. Next for the honourable mentions is a Hoya. So I've got this Hoya here and this recent purchase, Hoya Lisa. So really nice plants, thick glossy leaves, really easy to care for. You can put them pretty much anywhere. You can put them in direct sun and they'll respond by kind of getting distressed look on the leaves, the coloration. This one's going pink, it's really interesting. So like I say, don't need too much water, don't really need a regular schedule of fertilization, and they'll just do fine in a low maintenance situation. Another couple of honourable mentions is a Kentia parlour palm, this is. So I've had this a couple of years I believe. It's not really grown any bigger than that, to be honest, and it still looks healthy. The leaves look green. I've not changed the pot. I give it a water every once in a while, and it just kind of happily sits there, not in a particularly bright location. So that's a good option if you're looking for low maintenance houseplants. Also, the very popular Monstera deliciosa. So this is a cutting I took from the mother plant that I have in my bedroom, featured in my bedroom tour video that I put out recently. So again, really not fussy plant. Doesn't really like having too much water in the soil, doesn't like wet feet, like all these plants. And also, it doesn't really like the roots being disturbed. It likes to have quite a tight, compact root system, so doesn't really appreciate having the pot changed every year. So it will happily sit in the same pot for a good number of years, so really useful. And then 2 last honourable mentions is just the umbrella plant, which is this guy here. Really like this plant with the variegation on the leaves. Really easy to care for, doesn't require too much watering, happy in a relatively dark location. And then this guy, which is the ZZ plant. I was going to attempt to pronounce the full name, but I don't think I'll bother. I don't want to embarrass myself, but really slow growing plants, and that's fine really for those of us that like low maintenance houseplants. Just plonk it in a position. This really doesn't want much moisture in the soil because it has these thick bulbs that the stems grow out from, and that's where it stores all the water. So if you If you give it wet soil all the time, that's really going to affect the leaves and the stems, and they're going to go a bit mushy. So really useful for those of us that just want to have a houseplant that just sits there. So there you have my top 5 low maintenance houseplants with a few honourable mentions at the end. Hope you found this useful. If you're looking for plants that are low maintenance, that don't require much attention because you don't have the time to look after them. If you like the video, then please give it a thumbs up. If you are new to the channel, then consider subscribing if you like content like this. Let me know in the comments any houseplants that you have that you think are low maintenance, any plants that I've missed. I'll see you in the next video. Thank you very much.